Welcome, everybody. I'm Bruce Baker, and this is another piece in the History of New Orleans series. And I'm talking today with Dr. Justin Nystrom of Loyola University in New Orleans. And he is the author, among other things, of a fairly recent book called Creole Italian, which is about the large but understudied Sicilian immigration to the city of New Orleans. So maybe the best place to start, Justin, is just by saying what motivated you to write about this and sort of where does it sit within other scholarship about the city?
Yeah, I mentioned before that my parents are Chicagoans, even though I spent my, all of my adult life living in the American South. I remember the first time I came to New Orleans, and I was like, wow, there's a Midwestern city urban vibe to New Orleans in that it does have this really German, Irish, and Italian um, imprint on the map. I mean, yeah, once you kind of like stop looking at all the French names, you realize, wow, there sure are a lot of other ethnicities here that you just don't see, of course, around the rest of the South. Although you do see a lot of Italian names in places like the Mississippi Delta for the same reasons that they end up in New Orleans. Um, and then my adoptive uncle, I always call him, who is an Italian American. He's actually from Calabria's ancestors, but he and I, spent a lot of time talking about this and kind of like, taking trips out to Mosca's and stuff like that, which is this, of course, famous roadhouse restaurant out on the west bank of New Orleans on the other side of the river from the main part of the city out in Wagaman, which, had this reputation as a mafia restaurant. And so the more I looked at it, I was like, this is really significant. And, we've talked a little bit about the historiography of New Orleans and how, New Orleans tends to tell the same story over and over again, even its historians. And, occasionally something really new comes out, but oftentimes it's an added layer of nuance. And I wanted to write something totally new. Um, and on top of that, I had spent a year working at the University of Mississippi, and I'd become really good friends with John T. Edge, the director of the Southern Foodways Alliance. And I've been kind of getting, I've always been like a avid cook and, grew up in a family where we cooked a lot. And, I didn't really fancy myself like super knowledgeable about food in the way that like a trained culinary person is. But I saw that people were writing about food, and I thought, well, it's my second book. You write your first book, and you kind of like, oh, okay, cool, I'm free, and I can write what I want now. And so I decided I wanted to write about Sicilians in New Orleans, and I wanted to write through the business of food because originally, if you come to New Orleans and you drive around, you notice all these little corner stores. It's a really unique aspect of New Orleans architecture. The little corner, little 45-degree angle, and all that. These were little neighborhood stores, and they were, of course, overwhelmingly in the turn of the 20th century into the first half of the 20th century, run by Sicilian immigrants, the immigrant generation, or maybe their kids. And at first, I would start, it was going to be I was going to look at corner stores, and I started, interviewing people about corner stores, and I'm like, well, I like longitudinal studies. So I wanted to go like, well, why are Sicilians here? And then, there's this, oh, they were cutting cane. I'm like, well, yeah, they were cutting cane, but there were Sicilians here before they were cutting cane. Why were they here? And ultimately it got me back to the estimable Sicilian lemon. And so lemons are after the end of the Napoleonic era, become one of the first really big globally traded perishables. And so Sicily was until 1936 the world's leading producer of lemons. And this is where money really starts to emerge as a mining and in citrus in Sicily. And so in the 1820s, 1830s, Sicily lemons start making their way across the Atlantic because even though it can take over 100 days to sail to New Orleans from Palermo, you pick a lemon green, it'll actually improve on the voyage. Sicily lemon picked green keeps a really long time if you treat it right. And so what you have are wealthy Sicilian merchants who establish a pretty thriving citrus trade both here and in New York. And so this is this beachhead, we're really talking 1830s, 1840s. By the start of the Civil War, Sicilians have almost monopolized both the interior and import-export of things like fruits, nuts, sort of cliche olive oil, but a lot of wine and things like that, cheeses, imported goods. And along comes the Civil War. They're not real devoted Confederates, but what they do is they take this money, this really quite substantial money they made, and they modernize their citrus fleet and buy steamers. You don't have bananas yet. They don't build the steamships for the bananas. They build them for the citrus, because then they can make the Palermo to New Orleans run in 29 days. They diversify into tropical fruit because they bought these ships and they're really expensive. And you also need speed for bananas, because bananas go, unlike lemons, bananas go bad really fast. And they can air condition them. I say refrigerate them, but you really air condition bananas. You don't refrigerate them or they'll go bad. And then they really start making some big money, So you have these really powerful Sicilian, some of the biggest shipping merchants in New Orleans by 1880 are actually Italian. They're the coming business elite of the city. And what they do is once they have these ships in 29 days, they start bringing immigrants, and they start bringing a whole lot of them. So, that's why they're here. So,
right.
Short.
So it's interesting that, I suppose the sort of large-scale immigration, we always think of it having push factors and also pull factors. But then also, as you're pointing out, part of it is sometimes just logistics. They've got this shipping already going, and there are people who want to immigrate, so they add that into.
It does coordinate with really rough times in Sicily. The unification of Italy as a kingdom. Sicily always being treated poorly within the Italian context, but also like Sicilian migrant laborers are being actively recruited by these fruit merchants who become labor agents, and they go through these little towns. And one of the great ironies is it's New Orleans where they become Sicilian. In Sicily they're from Taormina or from Castelvetrano or Monreale, and they would have never gone to these places when they lived in Sicily. And they get on the boat and they're in the French market, and you have these people from all over the island, and they don't see themselves as Italian, right? Because Italy's that place that's been oppressing them, but they see themselves as Sicilian, where they might be Pugliese or something before they before they got on the boat. And the irony is they may have met somebody who lived 30 kilometers away for the first time here in New Orleans.
Right, that's really interesting, because of course that's a theme that we also see in immigration history of the Irish, for instance. Somebody from Galway, thinks of themselves to some extent. These sort of national identities sometimes get constructed in the immigrant communities where they land, and that sort of smooths out differences. So once you do get sort of large-scale Sicilian immigration to New Orleans, how do they integrate into the political structures there? Do they start becoming a significant sort of constituency that has to be appealed to and that sort of slots into the structures?
Yeah, well, they come to a city that already has a factionalized politics that is ready and waiting for them. One of the movies I show, just a clip from for my students in my New Orleans history, is the fight scene in Gangs of New York, because this sort of nativist versus immigrant tension that Herbert Asbury, who also wrote The French Quarter, which as a book is, I think, actually holds up. Like I have a lot to say about Herbert Asbury and his work, his writing about New Orleans, and the sort of nativist political machine sort of rooted in the Protestant Americans. These are generalizations, there are bleedovers, and then the sort of the vestiges that descend from the Francophone Creole, but are bolstered pretty significantly by the German immigrants and also the Irish immigrants. The Sicilians make a natural pairing for these, and when they settle in the French Quarter, which is solidly in this political geography of the city anyway, they become, and you got the other thing is the Sicilians are organized in ways that these other immigrant groups aren't. Of course, the 19th century is about belonging to clubs. So like the Hibernians have their club and the Germans have a couple of different clubs, and that's important. But the Sicilians work on the waterfront. And so longshore work is about being in an organized gang. I mean, like they were literally gangs. These were, these could also be violent gangs, but they were labor gangs. And they had labor bosses. And this was sort of that were not unrelated to the people who brought him here in the first place. And so there was a natural leadership class, the merchants, already here by the time masses of migrants started coming. And so there was a ready-made leadership, there was a ready-made political structure that kind of welcomed them in. And one of the reasons why ultimately you see Chief Hennessy, the reaction, right, in 1890, when Chief Hennessy honestly, Chief Hennessy is not the most saintly person in the world, gets himself involved in a Sicilian dispute in the wrong way, gets his ass shot. And then, of course, there's this huge anti-Sicilian riot where they go and break these acquitted defendants out and lynch, I think, 11 of them. That's not so much about Sicilian criminality as the Sicilian merchants are the rising political power. They are the rising financial power, right? The people who go and lynch the Sicilians in the Murray Street prison in the Treme, these are people who are tied to sugar, which is in free fall in the 1890s, and they're tied to cotton, which is, with the exception of the Great War, is in steady decline all the way through the Great Depression. And like the Sicilians are in tropical fruit. They're importing European goods. They are very successful.
That's a really interesting angle on that event that I'd never really thought of before, sort of the economic sectors that are represented there.
They killed Joseph Macheca, who's the biggest. He's actually Maltese, but he's adopted by a Sicilian family, one of these trading families. They killed Joseph Macheca, who he owns 6 steamships.
Yeah.
Like 6 steamships, that's a lot of dough. Yeah.
It really is. It really is. I suppose, and Hennessy was no saint. The only thing you could say is he was a little bit more saintly than his brother, who was even worse.
Yeah.
So as we get sort of to the turn of the century, I thought another really interesting thing that you discuss at length in your book is the role that Sicilian immigrants played in establishing restaurants in New Orleans. I mean, well before the turn of the century, but what's their sort of distinctive position in that?
Well, part of this is the story of food culture generally. If you go and walk into the kitchen in a restaurant in London or wherever, you're going to find people who maybe aren't speaking English. And the same with the grocery stores, right? A grocery, a bar, a Quick Mart, stuff like that. These are businesses that are very immigrant friendly because immigrants tend to understand capitalism super well because most of them come from places where it's not particularly easy to engage in. And so they come here and they're like, wow, we just got to pay our taxes. And, we are used to living very difficult lives. We can all live together and pool. And like there tend to be family units too, like really, the patriarchy, some are matriarchal. But so all the kind of things that make them able to endure this hard time of, restaurant work is hard and it requires you to be subservient, right? You are serving, and like this isn't for an arrogant person to do, some tech person who, I've always wanted to run a restaurant. And of course they go out of business in 3 years. They don't know a thing about it. It's about hustle. It's about hard work. And so the Sicilians come here, but they originally, the restaurants that they start opening in the 1880s, really as early as the 1850s, are what we would call seafood restaurants. They're oyster saloons, lots and lots and lots of oysters. They of course, they're a maritime people, so they have very good ties. They have steady supply of things like pompano and, you know, grouper and all these other Gulf fish and lake fish, shrimp and all that. So they start cooking really ultimately what we would consider Creole food, you know, like they're Sicilians. And this is one of the ironies of my title of my book, is that it's these Sicilians become Creolized in this way, but they remain, it's sort of an homage to the sort of cultural imperialism of the notion of Creole. But ultimately, it's not until masses of immigrants, right before the like 1910, that pasta really takes off in this country, and then you start to see the spaghetti house. The real Italian spaghetti becomes a thing, as the kids like to say, and people start coming to New Orleans from all over the region, because there are few places in this country where you can get the real Italian spaghetti, and New Orleans is one of them. Obviously, New York, it's Philadelphia, Boston, but in the South, you know, if you're from Atlanta and you want spaghetti, you're going to get it in New Orleans, and you know, the tourists seek it out, and it converges with jazz. So the Sicilian restaurants emerge, the spaghetti houses emerge right around the time that jazz is getting popular. Sicilians, again, aren't chained to the past, right? They're not good Confederates. They're not particularly lost cause people, and they're very quick to embrace jazz. You could argue their complexion. I mean, some people argue that there's like this affinity for mixed people of mixed race, you know, people of color. I think you can stretch that much too far. I think the experience of the Sicilians is much easier. And I know there are Sicilians who would hate me for this, but what they can hate all they want. Like, people of color remain people of color. The Sicilians become white. And there are important reasons for that. And I don't say they become white, they're always white in the law, right? But there is a lot of cooperation across the color line, partly because of where they are. They're working in food and beverage. They're working in these kind of hustling industries. They're not afraid to do it, you know? Yeah.
To come back, I've got a question about what you were saying about the sort of early phase in the seafood restaurants and oyster saloons, which is, did these Sicilians have fishing fleets? You know, were they buying the seafood, or were they catching it and also supplying the restaurants?
Both, but they tend to buy it. Ultimately, you know, the Slavs come in here in a big way. The Voinoviches and so forth, the Uglishes and all that. The Slavic migrants that come here in the 1880s, again, another migration that there's almost nothing written about. They become very dominant in the fishing, you know, and there are, I mean, it's sort of like the Chinese. I mean, I've written this thing about the Chinese, a little brief glossy magazine article, and like the Chinese first show up, they're fishermen. I mean, but they discover dried shrimp, and the money's in dried shrimp. The money's not in catching the shrimp; it's in drying them, and that's what they do. So, you know, there are very few Chinese fishermen, but there are a lot of Filipinos. Actually, people don't think about that in New Orleans, but there's not an insignificant number of Filipino fishermen. Again, another seafaring nation with its coastal regions, with you know, a strong seafood tradition. And then, of course, you know, fishermen who'd been multi-generational, you know, Native American fishermen. They're buying from them because ultimately they realize the money is in the restaurant, where they can also sell booze. Fishing is a hard way to make money. You know?